Well, thank you everyone for having me present at this conference. I've been so excited to be here and learn from everyone and be part of this. So my name is Elisabeth Farrell, and in this session I'll be presenting about a literature review that I conducted on horses and humans and equine-assisted learning and human-animal studies. Before I go launch into that, I wanted to share just a little bit about myself and how I came to this topic, this area of study. So I'm currently a PhD student in the education department at the University of New Hampshire, which is also where I've worked for the past couple of decades with the Sustainability Institute, running sustainability education programs. And I'm also a horse mom to the girl right there on our pony Rosie, and have spent the past 5 or so years spending a lot of time at a 45 animal hunter-jumper barn, which has really brought me tremendous joy and learning, because I've never had the sort of resources and time over the years to be with horses in this sort of really consistent way. So sharing time with the animals and of course with my daughter has been a really incredible learning journey for me. And it's given me a lot of piqued my interest in thinking about how the different ways that horses and humans relate. So when I started this PhD program, what I was interested in was this sort of overarching question about how humans learn from non-human nature. And so specifically, I was looking at the area of biomimicry, which looks to nature to inspire different innovations in technology and education and various other social systems to move people toward greater sustainability. And one of the central tenets of biomimicry by Janine Benyus is this notion of nature as mentor. And I came across a philosopher by the name of Henry Hicks, who had started to build a body of work applying philosophical principles to biomimicry tenets. And it sort of associates this idea of nature as mentor with epistemology in philosophy, or how we know about the world. And so I began to wonder, what does it mean to take this idea seriously, nature as mentor or as teacher? And then what then are the epistemological and pedagogical implications of doing that? And so as I started to learn and investigate equine-assisted learning, I discovered a pedagogy that explicitly positions horses, in this case, as a teacher, or at the very least, as a co-facilitator of a pedagogy. And I haven't really seen other examples of this, though they may exist. So it was these sort of larger questions that motivated me to explore equine-assisted learning alongside this personal love of horses. So this session has 2 sections. First, I'll talk about the sort of key elements of the study that I did, the research questions and the methodology that I used. And next, I'll share the sort of findings and discussion, including study limitations and areas for future research. So for the purposes of this study, what I wanted to do was explore what I was viewing as 2 disparate yet related areas of research: equine-assisted learning and human-animal studies. I think everyone here is familiar with equine-assisted learning. Human-animal studies is a field of study in the social sciences and humanities that's generated a lot of scholarship examining relationships between humans and animals. And although this scholarship has investigated important ethical and theoretical dimensions of human-animal relationships, including horse and human relationships, my hypothesis was that it hadn't been given as much consideration in the practice and research of equine-assisted learning. And so just a little bit of a brief background on human-animal studies, as articulated by one of the scholars, Shapiro. He identifies the beginning of this field of study forming in the 1970s around sort of with moral philosophy and people like Peter Singer talking about animal rights and animal protection. And over the decades, identifies first wave, second wave, third wave, and fourth wave, kind of going from more quantitative to more qualitative to more interpretive thinking around the relationship between humans and animals. So it was sort of with Shapiro in mind that I began to argue in this review that equine-assisted learning could possibly benefit from being in a deeper conversation with these sort of scholarly and theoretical trends represented by human-animal studies. So to narrow things down, what I did is I looked at equine-assisted learning in adult populations, and human-animal studies focused on adult horse-human relationships. And I focused on adults here because I felt they represented a unique and important area of educational research that includes both formal and informal pedagogical opportunities for application. So for example, in 2018, Ilona Getmain-Hoffman argues that adult learners require, quote, educational experience that was more engaging, more flexible, and more appreciative of the existing knowledge base and experience of the adult learning. And according to her, the practice of equine-assisted learning is conducive to adult populations because it embodies these kinds of qualities. So the aim of this study was to sort of situate equine-assisted learning in these broader scholarly and theoretical trends and to identify new pathways for research and scholarship. So specifically, my research questions started with this broad look at the state of research in both of these areas, and was followed by an analysis to reveal what does this research tell us about opportunities for the development of equine-assisted learning approaches for adults. Here you can see my inclusion-exclusion criteria for this study, and the thing I would just point out here is I really focused in on equine-assisted learning on its own, so not in complementing other kinds of equine-assisted modalities. And so I carried out a broad search using these various databases. I used a number of different kinds of keywords to get at the types of work I was looking for, and of course included looking at bibliographies to identify other relevant sources. And so that really laid the foundation of the study. And this next section will talk about the findings and discussion. So in total, I ended up with 32 articles that I included in this study. And I coded them, as you can see here, into sort of two categories, or three, I should say: equine-assisted learning, human-animal studies, and this third, in conversation. And so the equine-assisted learning studies were focused on equine-assisted learning. Human-animal studies were focused on human-animal studies. And this in conversation were studies that were focused on equine-assisted learning, but with a human-animal studies lens. And so this really showed that these two areas are operating mostly in isolation of each other, but there's a conversation that exists or is beginning to emerge. And so next I'm going to talk about sort of 6 key findings that I lifted out of this. And the first being sort of communication. And in the research that I looked at with equine-assisted learning, I found that this is a pedagogy really focusing a lot on communication, and especially nonverbal forms of communication, such as body language and movement, to convey information and requests. And that the point of this with the horse is to sort of develop qualities within the human, such as presence, mindfulness, leadership qualities, communication, and others. And that I found this was often referred to as the process of mirroring, or this idea that the horse can be seen to reflect humans' levels of calmness or anxiety or stress, and that this process of mirroring then enables humans to then become aware of and then modify their own communication to better converse. And that these are skills that can then transfer into humans' professional and personal lives. And horses can also be viewed to reflect the human participant and come beyond the human participant, come to represent other individuals in the participant's life. So for example, in 2021, a study examining the use of equine-assisted learning with medical students and residents, Nicole Arts, Jesse Robbins, and Suzanne Millman, quote, a participant's experience of relating noncompliance in the horse to noncompliance among patients. And so this experience of addressing noncompliance with a horse forced the participant to, quote, deal with noncompliance by approaching it with curiosity and not as a defiance. And communication among is also a vital topic in this in conversation in human-animal studies literature. In here, scholars focus on how humans and horses co-create what scholar Carrie Brandt in 2004 argues is a third language. And I think this idea of a third language, it suggests a deeper level of communication, offering something beyond dichotomy of horse talk, human talk, and emphasizes how these species are interacting in a co-created sphere. Conversing in this third language, according to Brandt, can serve to blur the human-animal divide and can help to demarginalize nonverbal and interspecies communication, creating what she calls a space for, quote, understanding the subjective and intersubjective lives of those who cannot speak, humans and non-humans alike. And so this really kind of serves to bring us a little bit more from this instrumental to a more of a relational kind of perspective. And I'll get more into this as we go further along. The next piece is around learning. And so clearly the practice of equine-assisted learning raises essential questions about how humans learn from non-human animals. And a group of researchers in 2019, Anne Hemingway and colleagues, they sought to uncover this sort of mechanism of action involved in developing positive outcomes from equine-assisted interventions. And their findings link the emotional arousal followed by the positive effects involved in equine-assisted learning to behavioral outcomes central to equine-assisted learning pedagogy, including improved communication, confidence, and well-being. Scholars identified in this human-animal studies and in conversation categories also explore the learning process between horses and humans. And here again, they're talking about co-learning one another. And this process includes this emotional connection as well as somatic coordination. And it's related to ideas of performance and choreography, which I'll talk to you a little bit more about in a moment. Anita Mauerstedt, Donna Davis, and Sarah Cowell's 2013 study further suggests that through this process of co-learning, horses and humans are co-shaping and even co-domesticating one another. And so for equine-assisted learning, emphasizing this co-learning, co-shaping, and even this co-domesticating of learning in one another takes this notion of, I think, mirroring or the act of reflection from human to horse and back to one more akin to relation, suggesting not only this active exchange of awareness, but also this possibility of greater kinship. So the equine-assisted learning sources that I reviewed here demonstrate that this pedagogy is used among healthy adults in higher education and professional and leadership development and in personal and spiritual development. And as noted, these desired pedagogical outcomes include things like developing skills such as communication, awareness, leadership, problem solving. Some of the studies that I reviewed in the human-animal studies in this in-conversation area point to the possibility of expanding the study of equine-assisted learning into developing what David Abrams calls more than human consciousness and behavior. And in a small 2010 study, Dulce Garcia argues that horse-human relationships could possibly engender ecological awareness. In the area of human-animal studies, Biljana Fredrickson in 2019 introduces an idea of an interspecies pedagogy, which she says is capable of, quote, learning across species where perspectives of all involved subjects are respected and taken into consideration. And so these perspectives suggest that while equine-assisted learning is often focused on the human outcomes of this practice, this could widen and deepen in scope, challenging human relationships with non-humans in important pedagogical ways that support ecological resilience, adaptation, and sustainability. And so in other words, I think this can help move us from more of an anthropocentric perspective in pedagogy to one embracing a more of a multi-species ethic. Gender. The equine-assisted learning sources that I reviewed for this study really didn't explicitly focus on gender, issues of gender. And in fact, the disciplinary areas utilizing equine-assisted learning among adults were also mixed, including historically female-dominated areas like social work and nursing, as well as more traditionally male-dominated areas like medical school and business and management. However, among those in the human-animal studies and in conversation categories, there was an explicit focus on gender in a number of articles. And Garcia in 2010 points out, quote, the large number of women involved in the horse industry. And she posits that this could be a promising area for feminist studies. So for example, in their 2018 study, Catherine Dashbar and her colleagues, they explored how human gender stereotypes are transferred onto horses, with negative associations applied to female horses specifically. Linda Burke and Carrie Brandt in 2009 argued that gendered embodiment is performed in riding, while simultaneously offering the possibility of going beyond, quote, gendered and species divisions. And so this idea that interspecies relationships could help break down divisions between species, but also genders, has a lot of implications, I think, including applications for potentially useful for non-binary, transgender, and gender non-conforming individuals in this work. Aesthetics. Little of the equine-assisted learning research that I reviewed explicitly addressed aesthetic issues, yet aesthetics were embedded within the equine-assisted learning research in several ways. So Getme and Hoffman in 2019 points out that, quote, humans project onto horses, not surprisingly, many aesthetic qualities. And she points to, for example, the size and the symbolism of the horse, while Cheryl Miola in 2016 notes the novelty and challenge of the equine-assisted learning experience. Thank you. And the environment in which it's taking place. And so these characteristics introduce opportunities for what Bruce Ermacher in 2009 calls aesthetic learning experiences, which include, quote, connections, active engagement, sensory experience, perceptivity, risk-taking, and imagination. Aesthetic issues are explored among scholars in the human-animal studies and in conversation categories, including themes of performance, choreography, and affectivity. Kimber Sider in 2021, for example, discusses the idea of performance as relational and co-created. Emily Fuchs in 2019 invokes dance and choreography to describe the synchrony between horses and humans. And Linda Burke and Joe Hockenhall in 2015 described this as a fluidity, quote, a fluidity, a moving together. And furthermore, they point out that this human and horse dance occurs within a structure of specific spaces, which have been pointed out here in some of the studies alluded to around, does it make a difference if something is in a barn or in a lab? How these structures influence interactions between these two species. And I think the ideas here point to the possibility that aesthetics and aesthetic learning experiences could be a generative way to view the practice of equine-assisted learning. Again, bringing us from this projection to this moving together. And finally, the sixth piece I wanted to highlight was around ethics. And clearly, including the use of an animal in pedagogy raises ethical questions around humane treatment and experience of the animal. And this review did find one study that explicitly included equine experience in equine-assisted learning as part of the research. And this was a study by Ann Baldwin and colleagues in 2021, examining vital functions in humans and horses to measure stress response during equine-assisted learning sessions. And overall, the study's findings showed, mostly positive results for humans and no adverse consequences for the horses. These limited research findings don't indicate clearly a lack of ethical concern in this type of practice, but they do demonstrate that more research is needed to better understand the equine experience in this practice, as we've been hearing the past couple of days. Scholarship in the human-animal studies and in-conversation categories is interested in the horse experience and human-horse partnerships. And most notable here is this idea of agency of the horse. So in 2017, Linda Burke argues that the horse must be viewed as an individual with its history and its context. Santa Cartaluco and Nora Sherman in 2021 argue for recognizing the agency and subjectivity of the horse and promoting practices that enable this as a fundamental ethical obligation required in horse-human relationships. And implicit to this notion of agency are issues around power, control, and partnership. And this includes the possibility of refusal by the animal to engage with humans. And the opportunity is ripe, as we've been talking about here, for exploring these ideas further in the context of equine-assisted learning, which clearly allows the horse a certain amount of agency, yet does so within particular environment and power structure. So next I'll talk about the limitations of this study, because there are a number of them. Firstly, I did focus narrowly on equine-assisted learning versus a broader look at equine-assisted interventions that include therapeutic or other approaches. And this might limit the findings that I've found here in different ways, because equine-assisted learning is often used in conjunction with these other modalities. Second, I didn't include a review of research focused on equine health, equine behavior, and training. And so perspectives from equine science and veterinary medicine would provide a helpful third lens to this topic. Third, I didn't analyze the quality of the studies themselves. So I didn't look at the methodologies, I didn't examine them or consider them in this analysis, which of course may impact the quality of the findings. And then finally, I did focus on adult populations, and including youth and adolescent populations in future studies could further strengthen this research. But nevertheless, I think several themes emerged that are rich for further investigation and could advance this research and practice of equine-assisted learning. Notably, I think this review demonstrates that equine-assisted learning could apply to new populations of adults in creative ways. So for example, explorations of gender that weren't explicitly investigated in this research could be integrated in a lot of exciting ways using insights drawn from human-animal studies research. Equine-assisted learning could be a promising pedagogy in higher education to explore curricula related to sustainability, environmental studies, aesthetic learning experiences, gender studies, and communication. So one recommendation for future research in equine-assisted learning is the development of human ecological values and behavior. And so, for example, Garcia's 2010 research, quote, suggests that the potential of equine-facilitated activities to advance a positive state of mind and ecological awareness may be significant. Investigating the development of ecological awareness in the context of equine-assisted learning could provide new opportunities for extending the application of equine-assisted learning to disciplinary areas such as sustainability, environmental studies, the social sciences, and humanities. And studies that incorporate the experience of the equine and the human and further build on Fredrickson's 2019 concepts of an interspecies pedagogy, I think would be a particular interest here. These studies would be particularly valuable, I think, in the context of higher education and professional development curricula. Further research exploring interspecies communication using equine-assisted learning would also be a valuable way of better understanding nonverbal communication. And insights here gathered from this work could inform a variety of disciplines as well, such as communication studies, disability studies, special education. And approaching this study through somatic pedagogies could link this research with aesthetic learning experience as well. And further exploration, for example, of this mechanism of action, of learning in equine-assisted learning, could have broader implications for a variety of pedagogical approaches. Furthermore, a different intersectional and transdisciplinary approach could introduce questions of gender and race, for example. Building on Garcia's observation, for example, that women represent a high proportion of those involved with horses, studies could focus on different phases of women's lives, like midlife, for example, or explore issues related to gender fluidity. And so finally, I think further investigation into the ethical dimensions of equine-assisted learning for horses is necessary. And situating this research within broader philosophical, cultural, and theoretical frameworks could further deepen this research. And some of this is happening in equine-assisted learning, equine-assisted services related to therapeutic uses. And so, for example, Madame Menosa Bennett in 2015 argues about Native Americans' ideas and about horses and animals can inform a more ethical approach to equine-assisted therapies. She points out, quote, "The view of horses or other animals as healers or facilitators in therapeutic processes cannot coexist with a Western view of dominance that holds them as inferior or allows for their exploitation." And of course, this is also true for equine-assisted learning. And I think this speaks to this broader question that brought me into this work in the first place. To accept nature as teacher or mentor, or even as co-facilitator, requires a worldview that is very different from the dominant Western view. And I think we need pedagogies that help to enable this shift, and I think that equine-assisted learning could be one of those models. Thank you. So I can take some questions. There are a bunch of sources here. Yes?
I'm really glad that you brought up intersectionality, particularly in this space. Could you first, for everybody that's here, maybe define a little bit more about what that means? And then how would you see that fit into not just equine-assisted learning, but kind of this theoretical model that would cross all horse-human interactions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think as I understand,
I
intersectionality, it's looking at the person in their various contexts as their gender, their race, their ethnicity, their class, social class, and taking all of those things into consideration and realizing the different ways in which these different identities play out in one's life and one's experience in the world. And so, I mean, I think there's just so much potential for studies that could look at different aspects of this, whether it be maybe focused on gender or focused on race, to see what are the learning outcomes and how do they differ among different types of populations with this kind of work. Any other questions? Yes.
This may be a little off the wall, but that's okay.
I like that. I like off the wall.
Somebody else was asking a question. Many of the folks who work day to day taking care of the animals in facilities are either volunteers or folks who have language challenges in learning English. Do you find, or is that a transection there? Is it you're working, you grunt, you leave? Or is there a benefit by being there and doing that work?
That's really interesting. I don't know the answer to that.
So if I am a recent immigrant, however I got here, and I'm at the racetrack cleaning these stalls, and I'm making my wage, I'm with the horses every day, I'm hearing the language, it's an intersection where I'm exposed to upper middle class, very wealthy. I have a lot of exposure if I am that person working there. Does that affect me in a positive or negative way? It's a transaction. I said it was an off-the-wall question.
Yeah. I mean, I would.
Because it hits gender, it hits race, it hits socioeconomic, it hits all of that.
It does.
And it's a population I don't see mentioned in any of these talks because they're not getting services. They're doing the work. but is there bad word that's spillover effect?
Really interesting. Yeah, I mean, we see this in a lot of my work professionally is around sustainable food systems, and so we talk a lot about the labor and who's doing the labor of the work, and I think that that's what you're describing here. I think there wouldn't, my speculation would be that there wouldn't be that positive effect. maybe there's some, but in terms of if you're not getting paid, what's the living wage of the person, what's the dynamics of power, and there's a lot that would go into sort of investigating that.
I read a really interesting please go ahead.
Yeah.
I read a really interesting piece that came out of National Public Radio a while back that was talking about internships in graduate school and the poverty level at which they are and the stress that they're under. And Somebody's Got Your Future actually being equated to the labor workers in the fields and the immigrants, and very similar. I remember that point of my life. Yeah, it was ugly. It's just an interesting thought.
It is.
For definition.
Yeah, no, thank you. That is great.
If I can add to it, I guess, or comment on that thought, it would be interesting to know just the piece about the day-to-day interacting with the horses and that effect. Mm-hmm. And however, I do know that the equine industry is having conversations at the higher level of the negative effect of the, why is it that the majority, I'm just going to use this as an example, why is it that the majority of the folks cleaning the stalls and taking care of the horses at the racetrack are Hispanic, and that's it. Mm. You don't see, you rarely see them moving to become a jockey or a horse owner or any of that. So there's a lot of those conversations going on at the I guess organizational or association level.
And that's very similar with animal production and agriculture as well.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think is interesting is we're not necessarily talking about a targeted intervention. We're talking about a bit of an organic experience. So for those of us with EAS centers, what are the benefits to our volunteers? Mm-hmm. We know about the benefits of volunteering, right? But what are the specific benefits to volunteering in an EAS center?
Right.
That's, I think, really important. Are they not, for me, that's the most people who come across my facility. So if you talk about resources, to some degree, they're my biggest population.
Right.
I have a question about the terminology of that, and you talk about labor force. And I wonder if changing the terminology from volunteer to unpaid intern or intern would change their perspective on their role.
Nancy, we actually analyzed that here in Fieldstone when we did our strategic plan. So we created a piece of design thinking to outline the ecosystem, so parents, students, volunteers, donors, board members, even down to the farriers and the vets and et cetera. And one of the personas that we analyzed was volunteer. And so we started with an empathy map. So we analyzed what they think, what they say, what they do, how they feel. And then we took that and created a problem rundown. So how we, causality, volunteer needs this to do that. And then we sort of took it into the rest of our strategic planning process. So I'm probably happy, assuming nobody cares, I'll have to share that research or that data.
That would be awesome.
That would be
It's pretty cool. I mean, we had representatives from multiple personas, so we had Fieldstone staff, executive staff, board members, other volunteers, other donors, parents, sort of all give their perspective on what that persona might, be doing. some cases, a volunteer may actually be a parent, a volunteer may be a board member, a volunteer may be a donor. So in some cases, those individuals may wear multiple, fall into multiple persona categories. So, for what it's worth.
No, I didn't see that.
Thank you. And which one is, other questions? Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.